In this video, we will address the disappearing Electoral College and what can be done to save it. In a previous video, I showed how elections at the state level have been blue-shifted over time by gluing a Democratic direct primary onto the Republican election method for various offices, holding popular votes in elections that previously used unbound delegates, and adding pay-to-play schemes for special ballot access. What you might not have realized is that our elections have also been turning blue at the national level for more than 200 years. So far in this election reform series, I have debunked several misleading claims made by progressive groups that are trying to erase the last vestiges of republicanism from our elections. I'm going to show you how to thwart such claims forever and restore and protect the real Electoral College. One such common claim is that because indirect elections, such as the Electoral College is intended to be, do not produce the same result as popular vote elections, they must not be representative of the people. This claim is misleading because the Founding Fathers instituted different election methods that by design produce different kinds of candidates as part of the system of checks and balances. When you erase the differences between the methods, the checks and balances collapse, which results in worse representation. The bad news is, we're already most of the way there.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead.
To understand why erasing the differences is problematic, it's important to know that there were originally 3 different main election methods under the Constitution: direct, indirect, and legislative elections. We'll briefly go over each kind. First, direct elections are also known as democratic elections because they use a simple popular vote. In a direct election, the people directly elect their representative in government using a popular vote. Whoever gets the most votes from the general voting population wins. Direct elections are provided for in the Constitution in House of Representatives races. The idea is that members of the House represent what is popular and are most responsive to the people at large. An indirect election is different. Indirect elections are also known as Republican elections or delegated elections. In an indirect election, the voters meet to select delegates whom they trust to have better than average wisdom, integrity, and virtue. And those electors then vote for a candidate to fill the office. What it sacrifices in responsiveness to the general electorate, it makes up for in producing better informed voters and more carefully considered decisions. The Electoral College for electing presidents is supposed to be this kind of election. Originally, state governor races were this way as well. The third kind of election is a legislative election. In a legislative election, legislators who were previously elected in the state elect the public officer. State legislators themselves were typically elected using a combination of direct and indirect election methods. So the legislative method is basically an even more indirect method of election, using a voting body that has already been informed by both of the previous 2 methods. The Constitution originally specified that United States senators should be chosen by the legislature of the state. Senators in state legislatures were also often elected using an indirect method as well. Taken together, all 3 methods inherently provide a check on each other. If the candidates were not meaningfully different from each other, they would provide no real check on each other, because their biases would all be the same. The United States Supreme Court has recognized that different election methods lead to different kinds of candidates being elected. This is explained in greater detail in the Federalist Papers and was discussed in the Constitutional Convention as among the reasons for providing these different election methods. By design, House representatives are supposed to be more Democratic. Executive branch officers are supposed to be more Republican. And national senators are supposed to be representatives of their state's legislature, since that is how each office is elected. This is how you actually control for the kind of candidates you will get. When I say Democratic or Republican, by the way, I mean the principle, not the party by that name. What has happened over time is that these distinct election methods have been eroded, resulting in a catastrophic implosion of checks and balances, and in the process, diminishing the representative power of the people themselves. As an example, in 1913, the 17th Amendment eliminated the legislative method for electing senators and replaced it with a popular direct vote. At first, this can seem like it gives the people more representative power in government. However, as we'll see shortly, that's not the case. The same thing has been happening ever since the Constitution was ratified, as an increasing number of states have adopted direct elections and installed direct Democratic primaries as part of the progressive movement in the early 1900s, on top of or in place of Republican election methods for the executive branch and other offices. The result of all of this is that the election systems for practically every office have been consolidated and homogenized, meaning that the government is now controlled by an all-blue uniparty, with no internal checks or balances, regardless of how they may represent themselves externally to the public. If you use a blue election method, you will get a blue candidate. If you use a red election method, you will get a red candidate, and so on. The nominal party affiliations only reliably go as deep as they can keep up appearances. The United States government or any other government in this consolidated state, factually speaking, is controlled by Democrats with a lowercase d, no matter what they call themselves in partisan terms. And to be fair, Democrats with a lowercase d do have a place in government, namely in the House of Representatives, but they should not be allowed to monopolize the whole government as they have done. Perhaps the worst aspect of all of this is the party system, where supposedly private organizations are given special access to government power, further disenfranchising the electorate. George Washington had something to say about that. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from partisan misrepresentations. The warning about parties misrepresenting themselves or each other is clearly prophetic and applicable to our day. But wait, you might ask, weren't we talking about the Electoral College? And isn't it still Republican? That is, an indirect election method? On paper, yes. But there's a catch. Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution provides that each state shall appoint a number of electors in a manner to be prescribed by the state's legislature, who then proceed to cast votes for the president in an indirect election, which is a Republican method. The catch is, we don't actually follow that today for the most part, or even the version amended by the 12th Amendment, which installed the two-party system, which we'll get into in another video. But here's how we don't follow what is in the Constitution. Let's say you are one of these electors, chosen by your state in the manner your state legislature has determined. But here's what the states did, and more specifically the parties in many of the states. They said, you can represent us to the National Convention of the Electoral College, but if you vote for a candidate we don't like, we will nullify your vote, replace you, and perhaps punish you. So in other words, in all such settings, no, you are not free to vote the way you see fit. In this nominally indirect election, not free to make your own choice is what the word bound means. And most electors in the Electoral College today are referred to as bound electors, according to the laws of the state or the rules of the party. The Supreme Court even decided that a state could punish electors for failing to vote in agreement with the popular vote, and force the indirect vote to correspond to a popular vote, despite the fact that the Constitution grants neither the parties nor the government any power to do so. The effect of binding electors is that such an election is no longer indirect. Since the vote of electors is bound to mirror the popular vote, you inherently get a Democratic candidate because it is a democratic process, not a Republican one. I call this vote laundering, where the Constitution prescribes or the people choose to have a certain electoral method, but the powers that be in the government, special insiders, or people who pay to have extra representation, have power to change the type of candidate elected by changing the method itself. This happened in my state. It is also happening at the national level through bound elector laws and party rules. In case you're wondering what got me thinking about this, it's the fact that we vote multiple times in each election using increasingly democratic methods. Not to mention the fact that many of the electors in the end have no real electoral power, but instead are forced to comply with the party's wishes by the inclusion of binding rules or additional stages of elections that shift the candidates towards the blue end of the spectrum. None of this reflects what is actually written in the Constitution. There's that line from the Schoolhouse Rock video taught in taxpayer-funded schools, claiming that the pledging of electors after a popular vote is the Electoral College functioning as the Founding Fathers intended. Only, that was a lie. It's not in the Constitution. It's not functioning as the Founding Fathers intended, because we have perverted it. And it comes down to the undeniable definitions of words. To elect means to choose. By definition, an elector is not free to choose if someone else has made the choice for him. You could not have free and fair elections if you were not actually free to vote your conscience rather than voting how someone else told you to vote. Hence, binding electors is unconstitutional. This, together with the consolidation of more local elections, is the magic trick that turns red elections blue, erases checks and balances, and confiscates your representative power in the process by giving the people a different outcome than what we asked for. A bound elector is a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing. Binding electors turns the Electoral College into a district-wise popular vote, which is just a popular vote with potential for gerrymandering. This means the candidates that are elected through this process are all Democrats, with a lowercase d. They're Democrats because they were democratically elected. Now, there is some nuance to this. Some states and parties have different rules about binding electors, but the unbound electors have never managed to swing a presidential election outcome since bound elector laws came into existence, so they have not been at a critical mass to turn the Electoral College back into a fully indirect election. Add to that the fact that parties have controlled the nominations for nearly 200 years. While under the Constitution, they have no more authority to put anyone onto a ballot than you or I or your local tennis club do. So there is still a small element of republicanism in the Electoral College that could manifest itself whenever there are electors who are not bound and who are not controlled by the parties. And if we could ever get a viable candidate that didn't come from a two-party system. But we have arrived at a situation where, for practical purposes, the Electoral College is already mostly gone. Under the present system, we are technically allowed to vote, but we will get Democratic candidates in every election, regardless of nominal party affiliation, because that is how the voters are bound to vote. So what can we do about it? First, we can get educated. Read the Constitution and find out what's in it. I've placed an accessible link in the comments. Compare it to your local election processes and communicate with your representatives, party leaders, and neighbors about what you find. Document it and make your discoveries findable by others like I am doing here. If you have a caucus in your state, attend it and participate in it. Learn how the process works and run to be a delegate yourself if you want to preserve the indirect election system and are qualified to do so. The caucus convention, even though it is partisan anymore, may be the last vestige of Republican government at the local level.
The last remnants of the old republic have been swept away.
We're not to that point yet, but we are dangerously close. If the national popular vote movement succeeds, the last Republican elements and some of the last checks and balances in our elections will have been permanently destroyed. You can and should write to your legislators and urge them to oppose the national popular vote. Never stop educating yourself and your neighbors. Education is not alarmism. It is understanding of true and correct principles that will restore the checks and balances that will enable us to preserve the people's rights. Big government is the problem. Big government cannot be the solution. Turning our elections all blue, consolidating the election methods, makes for big government. The original elections under the Constitution were also all nonpartisan. Learn about that too. Finally, share these materials. If you haven't already, like the video, subscribe, and comment and share your findings and this series relentlessly with others. I've started a Patreon that you can find a link to in the description to help support this work. If you have video editing or other skills and want to help, please get in touch. You can find my email on the channel's page. In summary, the Electoral College of today only superficially resembles the original design of the Founding Fathers, and very little of republicanism remains. As I illustrated in another video, the United States Supreme Court has already found that by changing the election process, you change the kind of candidates that get elected. The kind of candidate you will get is determined by the election method, not by the party affiliation. I've created this very boiled down infographic, which is also linked in the description, showing some of the changes to the election systems in the United States over time, although I will probably update it to make it look nicer and be more complete. It would be very informative to document all such changes exhaustively, but the overall pattern is progressive homogenization of the methods, and the rise of partisan control over our elections. With each of these changes, the people were promised that they would have more representative power, but in reality, each time we got less, because the checks and balances that restrain the government from usurping power over us have been erased, giving the government more power, taking away the right of the people. Though far from comprehensive, these are some of the obvious landmarks of departure away from the constitutional checks and balances. Here's a fun activity. Go onto ChatGPT and type in a question like, when did my state start having direct primary elections? When did my state dispense with indirect elections? When did my state adopt binding elector laws. You could even ask it to perform some reasoning tasks for you, such as, what are some possibly unintended effects of homogenizing election methods? Why did the Founding Fathers include different election methods? Some of the greatest resources out there are the Constitution itself, but if you're looking for an accessible way to get into this, I think it would be hard to go wrong by just asking sincere questions and locating truthful information that answers your questions. I also have a website, constitutionalvote.org, where you can learn more about how we are still losing electoral power through the two-party system and find out about the principles that can restore it. And I haven't even told you yet how exactly the parties took control of this whole process. To find out how, watch the next video.